episode, Laurie, you could tell us a little bit about your book and sort of what compelled you to write the book, what the book's about, and sort of go from there, really. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your book?
Travelling by Train, The Journey of an Autistic Mother. It's published by Panama Press and available through me, through Amazon, through other online retailers, and available on Kindle.
Yes, I should actually say now I finally, after all of these weeks, managed to get a hold of the Kindle version and read it last week. It only actually took me 3 days to read, which for me is quite quite an achievement. I found it a really sort of, I got really quite engrossed in it and really sort of hooked on sort of turning the pages and getting to the next section. But for somebody who perhaps isn't aware, and perhaps thinks from the title that maybe it's a travel book, tell us a bit about the book, Laurie. What does it sort of cover, and what was its purpose?
It's a book about determination, it's about resilience, it's about developing strategies, overcoming obstacles, facing prejudice, working to rules that you don't understand, trying to operate and live within a system that seems hostile, that's confusing. And it's all seen and written through the eyes of me as an autistic parent.
It's probably also worth sort of just giving a little bit of context in terms of when you start the book. Obviously, it's before you had your diagnosis. You didn't have your autism diagnosis, until later in life. I think, were you 44, or is that right? But when we pick up the story as the reader, it sort of starts around and is centered around, one of the children having what was described at the time as a non-accidental injury, and almost a sort of finger of suspicion as to how that injury had been caused and who by. But obviously, because of the way that the sort of communication was, you didn't understand the gravity of what was happening and the reasons why, social services and the authorities were sort of asking those questions. And one thing that sort of stuck out with me all the way through is where they kept saying to you, if you're open and honest with us and you just sort of tell us, what you can and what happened, it will be better for you and it will look better for you. And knowing, obviously, you as I do, as an autistic person, it was really interesting for me, because I thought, but she's not going to understand what you mean, and that, there must have been so much confusion. So, can you just sort of take us back to that sort of beginning point? I think you were bathing 2 of the children, and then obviously realised that with the younger one, you had some concerns and maybe needed to go to the hospital. Let's just sort of start there with the book, if we can.
Right at the beginning, it was December the 4th, 1993. My first marriage broke down in 1992, when I was just about to turn 31. And when my marriage broke down, I was the one who left home. And so my 2 older children stayed with their father. Now, I think I have to say why I left the children at home, because it's entirely an autistic thing to do. It was so as not to create too much disruption and too much change in their lives than was absolutely possible at the time. I know I've mentioned this in other talks that we've had, but to me, consistency is the key. And whenever any changes have happened, I've prepared the children for them as much as I can. I've involved them in the planning and in what's in the processes, simply because that was not how I was treated when I was growing up. And I know how distressing and upsetting it was for me. So I vowed to do something different when I had children. Now, I wasn't in a relationship where there was any violence or abuse or anything like that. But I was unwell, and I was becoming increasingly ill while I was in the marriage. And my self-esteem was practically nothing. I thought my children deserved better than that. and I thought they'd be better off without me. So I had two options really, was either to leave home or leave this planet. And I took the idea that they had the right to know me, and they had the right to know who I was. So I left them at home, in their own house, their own beds, their own toys, their own neighbourhood, their own schools. Their dad was there, who was perfectly able to look after them. And as far as I could see it in my head, was that the only thing different for them was that Mum wasn't there when they got up in the morning, and I wasn't there, you know, during their day-to-day lives. Now, I spent about 3 or 4 months homeless. I was sofa surfing, essentially. And I ended up buying the house that I still live in. And that's when I ended up, I was in a relationship too soon, really. Had another baby, and this is the baby that most of the book's centred around. It's not so much my story, but it's our story. So that particular weekend, my 2 older children were staying. They'd come over for the weekend, and we were having a family time. And that's when my youngest son became ill in the bathroom. He'd obviously been ill for a number of days, but I hadn't really picked up on it too much for several reasons. Is that one, he's different. He was a mixed race baby, and there were certain features about him that were very typical of a mixed race child, so that I didn't necessarily know the difference between what was normal and what was not, because I'd never had a mixed race baby before. So it'd been slightly off colour, and that was the biggest difference I'd known. And this was over the weekend, and I'd had it in my head. Look, if he still doesn't seem any better, I'll just take him to visit the health visitor on Monday. But of course, we never got there because he went into a state of collapse in the bathroom on the Saturday night.
When it was first explained to you that, you know, after the doctors and medical professionals had had a look at the child, you know, when it was first explained to you that this wasn't an illness, and actually they felt that it was maybe a non-accidental injury, and so what did that mean to you? You know, what were your immediate thoughts?
I didn't know what a non-accidental injury was. I thought, a non-accident is like a non-event. He hasn't had an accident. So he was ill, he'd get better, and I could take him home. And that was the immediate thought that went through my head. But then they went on to say the police and social services are in a room over the corridor waiting to interview you. And I couldn't understand that. Like, why? Why is this happening? He hasn't had an accident, so why am I being interviewed? I think that would probably be quite an expected response for somebody who's autistic and tends to take things literally, somebody who's had no experience of that kind of situation anyway, somebody who spent 4 days. This was the Thursday, and it was the Saturday night he went in hospital. So for all of that period of days, I'd had the same questions over and over again. Had I noticed anything different about him? How long had he been ill? Was he this? Was he that? Was he one thing or another? Has he been left with anybody else? Has he been shaken? Has he been dropped? Has he been this? Has he been that? He'd had to have test after test after test. He'd had every bone in his body x-rayed. He'd had ultrasound scans through his fontanelle, the soft spot on the top of his head. He'd had an MRI scan where they had to fully sedate him to put him through the scanning machine, which I describe in my book as a bit like a shopping machine conveyor belt, a supermarket conveyor belt, taking him through into something like an oversized mouth of a washing machine. and I was away from home. He was only 6 weeks old. I was still full of hormones. I was very worried. I'd got my other children to consider. It was all incredibly confusing. Yeah, I was supposed to understand everything and know all these things and to be able to make rational responses, appropriate decisions, take actions. And I didn't know, I really didn't know what I was doing. I had absolutely no idea what was happening.
And I think when you read the book, certainly I found, there are moments that are funny in the book, not in terms of when you're sort of talking about the injury and so on, but when you sort of talk about the things that happen in terms of your life and the taxi driving and the different things that you did, there are bits that are quite funny. So on some levels, it's quite an informative book. It's quite a funny book. But I sort of found myself at times getting quite angry with the system and the way that you'd been treated and the suspicion and the way that they treated the whole family. But then at times you sort of find yourself cheering for you and the determination and everything that's being shown. And one thing that sort of struck me is I'd read about the social services reports and how they discredited some experts, and it almost felt as though what they were trying to do was make it almost impossible for you to get things back on track and bring the child home and have any sense of normality. It felt actually as if they were the barriers, they were the aggressors, and actually they were deliberately at times treating you very badly. And I can't help but wonder, even all these years later, do you have any resentment towards some of the social workers? Because some of the examples of behaviours and things that the social workers did that you mentioned in the book were really quite eye-opening for me and quite surprising. So I can't help but wonder, do you still have resentment towards some of those systems, processes and people?
I didn't have time to have resentment. I was very angry in a lot of time and in a lot of places, particularly because it was hard for me to show any emotion. Because if I got upset, which is natural and it's understandable, if you coming from the angle of me as an innocent person, no, I didn't cause the injury, then I think being angry and confused was pretty understandable. Yeah, and I was. If I showed any anger or I got upset, they would just see that I was mentally unstable, and that was just another reason not to allow my son to come home. So I was in a kind of emotional straitjacket. But yes, I did get upset. I did get tearful. I did get angry. I was confused. All of these are very emotional things. I don't know about resentment. I felt that it was very unjust, because what seemed to be happening was that they were looking at everything I hadn't done, everything I couldn't do, and overlooking completely everything that I could do and everything that I was doing. It was very obvious that I was a very involved parent. I was very caring. I was very loving. The people surrounding me saw me with my other children as well, because my older children came to visit and they were also part of this unit. They saw how I related to them. When we were in the mother and baby home, my daughter liked nothing more than to actually go in the bath with her baby brother. So sometimes while we were there, when she came to visit, I used to give her a bath early, just so that she could go in the bath with her brother and play with her brother, like you would do if we were in a home environment. And this wasn't taken into consideration. When the reviews and the reports came out, it didn't look like me that they were writing about, because there was nothing positive in there. It was almost as though I was being set up to fail. And why I was being set up to fail was because there'd been no admission. Nobody had said, oh, hang on there, I'm really sorry I'd done it. And I felt that all of this constant request from them, be open with us, be honest with us, and we can work with you. What they really wanted was for me to say, I'm so sorry, I've done it, I must have done it. I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I want to make everything better. I honestly think that if I'd admitted to something I hadn't done, I would have just been signing my own death certificate. They'd have said, look, she's violent, she's admitted to doing this, the baby needs to be removed.
There were all those reports from the different experts. There was then a court case, and it went the full way, if you like. The worst case scenario you can imagine. For you, that was a scenario that you lived through. So when it went through that sort of court process, and the experts, as they were, gave their evidence, and obviously you were questioned and so on. When the outcome in terms of what did happen, or what was suspected to have happened, to have caused that sort of non-accidental injury, as they'd labelled it, how did that make you feel?
After the judge's decision?
Yes.
Right. Oh God, that was an awful day. It was but it really was, and I describe it in my book as like being in labour all over again, because I was just pacing the dining room, and ironically, it was the dining room that it was where my son was born. He was born at home in that very room. It was absolutely horrendous, because we were told this was all stuff that I didn't know anything about. We'd had 5 days in court in the run-up to Christmas, and then we ran out of time. So days had to be scheduled after Christmas, so we'd had that period of time where it was just a waiting game to go back to court, and we got a different court to go into after that. And we were given the date. When I say we, it was everybody involved. It was me, and my little group, and the social services and everything. We said, this is going to be the date when the judge's decision comes out. It's loads and loads of stuff I didn't know anything about. It's a family court, it's closed. They don't allow members of the public in, they don't allow the press in or anything like that. It's just the judge, there is no jury, and it's the judge who makes the decision. And he doesn't make it on the day. As you would in a criminal prosecution, you get the jury adjourns, they discuss it, they reach a verdict, and then you all come back into court and it's given out. It wasn't like that in this case, because how it works in the family court is that the judge has to weigh up all of the evidence and all this sort of thing. It's not called a trial, it's called a hearing. And I talk about this a little bit in my book. It's called a hearing because nobody's on trial, but somebody was on trial, and it was me. It was very obvious from very early on that the judge wanted to make a finding, and it was absolutely terrifying. I would never want anybody. It was the most awful thing to go through. It was the most awful thing to go through, and because I knew that I was innocent. I knew I hadn't done it, and there was so much at stake. It wasn't just for me. It wasn't just for my baby. It was for my older children. It had already affected how I could have contact with them, because their father decided that he needed me to have supervised contact with them, where I'd never needed any before. I'd never been. My parenting had never been in doubt before. And suddenly I had to see them in a contact centre. Suddenly I had to see them when I was supervised. I couldn't have them at home here unless I'd got a member of the family that my husband approved of. It was awful. So all of this was at stake, and all of this was in my mind while I was waiting for the judge's decision to come through on the fax machine, which it was at the time. And I was I was so anxious, it just got too much, and I went round to a friend's house. I rang the secretary up at the solicitor's office and said, look, I'm going to be on this number. I can't bear to be on my own anymore. So I went round there, and that's when I got the telephone call. And my friend, who'd been very supportive all the way through it, she answered the phone, and she said, it's for you. She looked at me and said, it's for you. And it was... I felt like I was walking through a very dark space. It was a very long, slow motion kind of walk. The day it had been when I walked from the hospital room across the corridor and to be interviewed by the police and social services. And the secretary, it was all slow motion. And she said that the decision is coming through on the fax machine now, and I'm looking at the last few pages. And she was reading it to me, and not much of it was making sense, but I did hear that he felt that it was in the child's best interests to be returned home under a supervision order. And everything seemed to go calm and quiet. And I can vaguely remember just holding the phone in my hand and moving the receiver away from my face and looking round and saying, we've won. It was incredible. I had to walk then from their house to go down to see the solicitor. And it was surreal. It was like I wasn't in my own body. It was like the rest of the world was out there somewhere, and I wasn't really part of it. And I sat opposite my solicitor, and I'd known her since I was a teenager. And she cautiously congratulated me and said, I can't just go and take him home. He had to be reintegrated back into family life. It's something else I say in my book. It's one thing to remove a child, and it's another thing returning them. And we also had to wait 28 days for an appeal to be lodged. Mm. So we couldn't do anything until the social services and everybody else. So I wasn't going to appeal, because I wanted my son to come home, but they might well have done, and that's what they were kind of expecting them to do. And they launched an appeal, which came after 22 days.
And I mean, what compelled you? What sort of made you sit down and write the story? Because it's quite a powerful story, and I don't want to sort of ruin the story for anybody that might now go on and read the book or hasn't yet, but what made you think this story needs to be told? I need to write this book.
I think I was always aware that I needed to tell it. Right from back then, whenever there was a huge gap between when the end when my son came home in 1995. It was 12 years before I started writing the book. And I started writing the book it was 2010. So it was 15 years. I started writing the book in 2010 when I was at university. And what turned into the first chapter was submitted as part of a university assignment. And my course leader encouraged me to carry on writing. She said I was a very talented writer and to carry on writing it, which I did. And it was one of those projects that I picked up and I wrote, and then I left it, and then I went back to it. And eventually, it took me nearly 10 years from start to finish, really. So it was quite a long project. And of course, at the cut-off point in the book, between cut-off point in the book and the release of the book, an awful lot of life has happened since. So there's backstory, and there's life continued into the rest of the world. So into life since 2006. The book covers from 1993 to 2006. So it's just a 13-year period. It's not one of those books that starts off when I was little to present day or anything like that. It's that specific period of time from when my baby was taken into hospital to shortly after I got my autism diagnosis, essentially. And my autism diagnosis comes right at the end of the book.
I mean, for a first time author and for your first book, it's incredibly well written. Actually, I don't think if somebody picked it up and didn't know that was the first book you've written, they'd probably assume that you were a very experienced and highly accomplished author, because it's an incredibly well written book. I mean, do you have any plans or intentions to write any more books?
Well, one or two people have asked this, and yes, I think I probably ought to write the onward story, because I left it at a point where hopefully anybody reading it goes, but what happened next? And part of what happened next is part of what I talk about when I give a talk. Because one of the things that I do is I now design and deliver autism training workshops, and I give talks. And part of my talk is the difficulties that I had with my youngest son when he was growing up. I don't talk about the court proceedings. I don't talk about the fact that he was almost taken off me and adopted. So anybody who's heard my talk, the book is essentially the backstory to that. But what I do is I start at him being about 4 or 5 years old and going on to his present day. But because we're all still alive, I keep adding to that story. And there's stuff that I don't cover in the book for lots of reasons. Is that the publisher gave me, 60,000 words max. Oh, okay. I thought books had about 100,000 words in them. I don't know where I got that number from. So that is what I wrote. And she said, no, 60,000 words max. The book has to go through people's letterboxes. So I had to edit out 40,000 words. So some of the bits, I haven't gone into masses and masses of detail. So I've got all of those bits saved up and stored away somewhere. I've got nearly half a book, should I choose to use them. And there are bits that fill in the background. I mean, you were talking about the amusing bits about my life as a taxi driver. I believe you, me, I have got loads more stories.
Maybe that's a separate podcast that we should do, Laurie.
There is nothing stranger than real life, and it is. I have got some really, really, really funny stories in there. I don't know whether I actually can verbalise these funny stories that happen. But yeah, and I've got funny stories involving my children growing up, different adventures we've had, different escapades we've got into. The moving on from how I got him to go to the shop without having a meltdown. Once I developed a strategy and we could get to the supermarket without him having a meltdown and get round the supermarket without having a meltdown. They didn't stop there. We started having fun and we did all sorts of ridiculous schoolboy stuff. And that just does not appear in the book. I didn't have space. But yes, we've got adventures that have got stuff to do with blue mouth sweets, with fart gas, with sword fighting, with baguettes in Asda. I mean, there are tons and tons of stuff. Different pranks we've pulled. The whole 3-year-long obsession he went through of of getting his fingers stuck in shelving in shops, and it's just the whole ridiculous. This is our life. It hasn't been a litany of tragedy. There have been spots in it that you couldn't make up, and it's representative of actual real life, and presumably if you read the story around it, is an individual autistic parent autistically parenting an autistic child. And I definitely think there's a bigger dialogue that needs to be had, because there's not a lot being said about autistic people parenting autistic children. And I am very keen for that dialogue to happen. And there's a really, really, really good reason for that. And that is, I know I've come into a contact with an awful lot of people, especially since the book was published, where there are still people, autistic parents, coming into contact with the social services in the present day, whose actions are being misunderstood, whose parenting skills are being questioned simply because it's different, and simply because they demonstrate love and care and involvement in their children in what you might call an alternative way.